A cathedral filled with royalty waits for a bride who never appears. This is the true story of a royal bride who vanished on her wedding day, a mystery where immense fortune collided with ancient titles and a woman simply disappeared. By the end, you will understand the shocking truth behind one of history's most brazen disappearances. We will uncover the secret pressures she faced and explore whether she was a victim of foul play or the architect of her own escape. What does it truly take for someone to walk away from a life of privilege and never look back? Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt, and her life was a gilded cage. Born into one of America's wealthiest families, her destiny was not her own. Her father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, had built a staggering fortune from railroads, a fortune so vast, it was said, he earned more than $1 million every single month. That is the kind of wealth that creates dynasties, but in the Gilded Age, it could not buy social acceptance from the old money elite of New York. For that, the Vanderbilts and families like them needed something only Europe could offer, a royal title. And so, a new kind of transaction began. American dollars were traded for European nobility, with young women like Consuelo serving as the currency. From her earliest days, she was groomed for this singular purpose. Her education was not merely in literature and languages, but in the intricate rules of aristocratic etiquette. Her world was one of opulent Fifth Avenue mansions and summers in lavish Newport cottages, but it was also one of immense pressure. Her formidable mother, Alva, was the chief architect of this plan, a woman determined to see her daughter become a duchess. Every aspect of Consuelo's life, from the friends she was allowed to keep to the very way she carried herself, was meticulously controlled and refined for her ultimate debut on the European marriage market. She was, in every sense, a prisoner of her own privilege, raised to be the perfect bride for a man she had never met, a man with a title that would finally make the Vanderbilts respectable. The prize awaiting Consuelo was the title of Duchess of Marlborough, a name echoing with centuries of English history. This was not merely an aristocratic name. It was a dynasty forged by the great military genius John Churchill, a family that had served kings and shaped the fate of a nation. Their ancestral home was Blenheim Palace, a monumental estate so vast and ornate it was a testament to their former glory. But by the time Consuelo entered the picture, that glory had faded. The palace was a cold, drafty labyrinth, its upkeep a constant financial drain. The ninth Duke, Charles Spencer Churchill, was a man trapped by his own inheritance, presiding over a fortune that had dwindled to almost nothing. The gilded salons and priceless art of Blenheim were a facade masking a desperate reality. The Marlboroughs were, for all intents and purposes, aristocratically bankrupt. They possessed a name that opened every door in high society, but the coffers needed to maintain that society were empty. Into this desperate equation stepped the Vanderbilts, whose financial power was the perfect, almost irresistible antidote. The Vanderbilt fortune represented a literal rescue mission for a dying way of life. It could heat the palace's countless rooms, restore its art collections, and fund the extravagant lifestyle expected of a duke. For the Marlboroughs, an American heiress was not just a desirable match. She was a financial necessity. This was the high-stakes union, a transaction where a family's ancient lineage was the product, and a young woman's future was the price. The stage was now set for a courtship that felt more like a corporate merger than a romance. Consuelo Vanderbilt was introduced to the Duke of Marlborough at a grand Newport ball, a spectacle of wealth designed to impress. He was a man nearly a decade her senior, reserved and formal, while she was a sheltered girl of 17, conditioned for obedience. Their meetings were never private, always chaperoned and staged against a backdrop of immense opulence. Lavish dinners on yachts, garden parties at sprawling estates, and transatlantic voyages on luxury liners formed the scenery of their acquaintance. Yet beneath the surface of these glittering events, a silent, urgent negotiation was taking place. The discussions were not about shared dreams or personal compatibility, but about settlements and allowances. Lawyers and family representatives huddled over documents, hammering out the financial terms that would bind the Vanderbilt fortune to the Marlborough title. The Duke was not courting a woman, he was securing a subsidy. For Consuelo, this whirlwind was a blur of pressure and performance. Her mother, Alva, was the relentless director of this entire production, insisting that the Duke's interest was a monumental honor, a destiny that could not be refused. Every glance, every polite conversation was scrutinized and shaped to meet the expectations of a society that valued lineage above love. How could a young woman, raised in such a gilded cage, even begin to distinguish between duty and desire? The engagement was announced to great fanfare, a transatlantic triumph for the Vanderbilt family. But for the bride-to-be, it was simply the final, inescapable step in a path chosen for her long before she ever met the Duke. The wedding of the century was being planned, yet the heart of the bride was a territory no one had thought to conquer. The machinery of society began to turn for the wedding of the century. A dress of exquisite Parisian satin was commissioned, its train rumored to be so long it would require multiple pages to carry it. The guest list was a directory of global power, a who is who of European royalty and American industrial titans, all summoned to witness this ultimate union of new money and old blood. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic fed a public frenzy, publishing daily updates on the preparations, the estimated cost of the ceremony, and breathless descriptions of the bridal trousseau. New York itself seemed to be holding its breath, with crowds gathering for days outside St. Thomas Episcopal Church, hoping for a glimpse of the golden couple. Every detail was meticulously planned to project an image of flawless, storybook perfection. It was to be the crowning achievement of the Gilded Age, a spectacle designed to cement the Vanderbilt name into the annals of history. But beneath this dazzling surface, a very different reality was unfolding. The bride, Consuelo, was reportedly despondent, confined to her room under the watchful eye of her mother. Whispers suggested she had pleaded for a way out, her appeals met with an unyielding resolve. The pressure was immense, a weight bearing down on a young woman who knew she was the central prop in a play she never wanted to star in. The world saw a fairy tale, but behind the closed doors of the Vanderbilt mansion, the atmosphere was thick with a dread that no amount of satin or lace could conceal. All of this immense preparation, this global anticipation, was building towards a single, fateful moment at the church doors. What would happen when the music began to play and all eyes turned to the bride? The morning of November 6th dawned crisp and clear, a perfect New York autumn day for a wedding. Inside the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, a controlled chaos reigned. Housemaids rushed through the halls, while a small army of stylists and dressers attended to the bride. Consuelo was placed before her vanity, a silent figure as her hair was swept into an elaborate style befitting a future duchess. The atmosphere was one of intense, focused preparation, a whirlwind of pins and perfume that masked the profound stillness at its center. She was being transformed, piece by piece, into the icon everyone expected to see. Her mother, Alva, was a constant presence, directing the proceedings with an iron will, ensuring every detail adhered to the grand design. The famous wedding dress, a confection of white satin and priceless lace, was brought forth. It was heavy, its weight both physical and symbolic, as it was carefully fastened around her. The final touch was the veil, a gossamer cloud that obscured her view, perhaps a small mercy on a day when she felt like a spectacle. To the servants and stylists, she may have seemed quiet, perhaps merely a nervous bride lost in her thoughts, but that quiet was a deep and profound dread. There were whispers later, hints of a final, desperate plea made to her mother in a private moment, a last attempt to halt the inexorable machinery of the day. It was swiftly, decisively dismissed. The message was clear: the show must go on. Every action that morning was a step toward the altar, a performance of normalcy rehearsed for a lifetime. The flurry of activity was a mask, a brilliant distraction from the storm of despair gathering behind the bride's composed and obedient eyes. How could anyone have known that the most carefully prepared part of the entire spectacle was about to go catastrophically wrong? The carriage arrived at St. Thomas Church to a roar from the crowd. Consuelo, a vision in white satin, was led up the grand steps by her father, a picture of serene obedience for the thousands of onlookers. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the rustle of silk as the entire congregation, a gathering of global royalty and American elite, turned in their pews. The organist began the majestic processional. Every eye was fixed on the great doors at the back of the church, waiting for them to swing open and reveal the bride. The music swelled, reaching its crescendo. The doors remained shut. A murmur of confusion rippled through the nave. The music faltered, then stopped altogether. Where was she? A wave of unease swept from the altar to the very last pew. The Duke of Marlborough stood rigid, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. Whispers turned into frantic, hushed questions. Her mother, Alva, was seen being ushered into a side chapel, her expression one of sheer panic. The initial assumption was a simple delay, a last-minute adjustment to the dress, perhaps. But as minutes stretched into a quarter of an hour, the truth became terrifyingly clear. The bride was not late. She was missing. The perfectly orchestrated schedule had shattered. A frantic, discreet search commenced. Ushers checked the vestry, the choir loft, every conceivable alcove. Her bridesmaids, bewildered and frightened, scurried through the church's private rooms. They found nothing. The only trace of Consuelo Vanderbilt was her bridal bouquet, abandoned on a small bench in the room where she had supposedly been preparing to make her entrance. The delicate flowers, a symbol of joy and new beginnings, now seemed like a cruel mockery. The dawning horror was absolute. The bride had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a cathedral filled with the most powerful people in the world and a silence more deafening than any organ blast. How does a woman simply disappear from the heart of her own wedding, surrounded by hundreds of guests and a small army of attendants? Chaos erupted behind the marble pillars of St. Thomas Church. In the hushed, frantic whispers that replaced the wedding march, two starkly different theories began to take shape. The first and most charitable explanation was simple, cold feet. Imagine the sheer, overwhelming pressure on a teenage girl, they whispered. Faced with a lifetime bound to a near stranger in a foreign land, she had simply cracked under the weight of expectation. Perhaps in a moment of pure panic, she saw a sliver of an opportunity and took it, fleeing the church through a servant's entrance to escape a future she never chose. It was a story of human frailty, a desperate bid for freedom that anyone could, in their quietest hearts, understand. But then a darker, more sinister narrative began to coil through the minds of the elite guests. This was not a mere case of nerves. The bride was an heiress to one of the world's greatest fortunes, a prize whose value made her a target. Whispers of kidnapping slithered through the pews. Had someone, perhaps a rival family or a criminal element, snatched her for ransom? Or worse, had she been the victim of foul play, eliminated by someone who stood to gain from the marriage's failure? The very opulence of the event now seemed threatening, the crowds outside a perfect hiding place for a villain. And then there was the most calculated theory of all, that this disappearance was not a panic, but a plan. Had Consuelo Vanderbilt, pushed to her absolute limit, orchestrated her own brazen escape? Had an accomplice, a secret love perhaps, been waiting with a carriage around the corner, enabling a getaway so audacious it was happening under the noses of high society? The abandoned bouquet was no longer just a sad relic. It was a potential piece of evidence. Was it dropped in a frantic scramble, or placed carefully as a final, deliberate farewell? In those first shocking minutes, no one knew if they were witnessing a tragedy, a crime, or a rebellion. For the Duke of Marlborough, standing alone at the altar, the public humiliation was absolute. The whispers in the church curdled into outright shock, and every second that ticked by carved a deeper wound into his pride. He was a man whose entire identity was built upon centuries of unassailable dignity, and in a single moment, that dignity had been stripped away before the most influential audience in the world. His face, once a mask of aristocratic composure, crumpled into a visage of stunned, silent fury. There was no gallant concern for his missing bride, only a boiling rage at the personal and professional catastrophe unfolding around him. He was not just a jilted man, he was a duke whose entire financial rescue plan had just evaporated before his eyes. In the chaotic hours that followed, he retreated from the church, refusing to speak to the swarming reporters. His private devastation, however, was a storm of a different kind. The carefully negotiated marriage settlement, the millions of Vanderbilt dollars that were to restore Blenheim Palace and secure his family's future, had vanished as completely as the bride herself. This was more than a broken heart. It was a broken balance sheet. His family's ancient name, which he had believed was his ultimate bargaining chip, had just been publicly devalued. What good was a title if it could be so brazenly rejected? His statements to the press, when they finally came, were terse and cold. He expressed no worry for Consuelo's safety, only a formal, frosty disappointment. He framed the event not as a potential tragedy, but as a profound breach of contract, a personal insult from the Vanderbilt family. The scandal threatened to cripple his reputation permanently, marking him as the Duke who was not enough to keep an American heiress at the altar. Other wealthy families would now look at him with pity or, worse, suspicion. The transaction had failed, and in the brutal marketplace of titled marriages, he was now damaged goods. His humiliation was a poison that threatened to finish what financial decline had started, leaving him with a cold palace, empty coffers, and a title that suddenly felt like a crown of thorns. While the Duke nursed his wounded pride, a far more frantic and pragmatic operation was underway just a few blocks away. Inside the Vanderbilt mansion, the atmosphere shifted from panicked disbelief to a cold, determined fury. Alva Vanderbilt was not a woman accustomed to failure, and the public disgrace of a missing bride was a catastrophe she would not tolerate. Her immediate priority was not her daughter's emotional state, but the retrieval of her daughter's person and the salvaging of their family's reputation. With a fortune that could move mountains, she moved people. A small army of private investigators, the best money could buy, was dispatched into the streets of New York. Their instructions were simple and absolute: find Consuelo. They combed through train station records, questioned cab drivers, and pressed their network of informants for any whisper of a well-dressed young woman in a state of distress. The Vanderbilt name opened doors that were closed to the police, and their search was both wide and ruthlessly discreet. At the same time, a parallel mission was launched, a battle for public opinion. Reporters swarmed the gates of their Fifth Avenue home, demanding answers and printing increasingly wild theories. Alva knew that silence was an admission of guilt. She and her husband gathered their lawyers and public relations advisors to draft a statement. This document was a masterpiece of calculated ambiguity, designed not to reveal the truth, but to control it. It expressed the family's deep concern for their beloved daughter's well-being, framing her disappearance as a sudden, tragic illness that had overcome her just before the ceremony. There was no mention of a runaway bride, no hint of familial conflict, and certainly no acknowledgement of the Duke's public humiliation. It was a story of a fragile young woman succumbing to the strain of her own happiness, a narrative that painted the Vanderbilts as worried, sympathetic parents rather than the architects of a shattered alliance. This carefully crafted fiction was fed to the hungry press, an attempt to smother the scandal with a blanket of manufactured concern. But behind this public facade of maternal worry, the real search continued with relentless efficiency. The question hanging over the entire city was a simple one. Could even the immense power of the Vanderbilt fortune find a woman who did not wish to be found? The story exploded across front pages from New York to London. The news was simply too sensational to contain. A runaway royal bride offered a perfect storm of money, power, and mystery. Newspapers abandoned all restraint, competing with increasingly outlandish headlines. One New York paper screamed, "Vanderbilt heiress vanishes. Duke jilted at altar," while a London tabloid declared American dollar princess fools Duke Marlborough. The factual details of the abandoned bouquet and the stunned congregation were just the starting point. Reporters, hungry for any scrap of information, printed every wild rumor that reached their ears. Unverified accounts claimed Consuelo had been seen boarding a steamship to France, disguised as a maid. Another insisted she had fled to a secret lover's arms in California. The speculation was not just about her location, but her motive. Was she a heartless social climber who had changed her mind, a terrified victim of a family plot? Or a modern-day heroine bravely escaping a gilded cage? The press did not just report the story, they actively shaped it, creating narratives that sold papers and captivated a global audience. This was no longer a private family scandal. It had become a public obsession, a real-life melodrama playing out in daily installments for millions of readers. The pressure on the Vanderbilt and Marlborough families became unbearable. Every move they made was scrutinized, every statement analyzed for hidden meaning. The quiet, dignified search for Consuelo was impossible under the blinding glare of this media circus. The world was not just watching, it was waiting, demanding an answer to the question that now consumed 2 continents. Where in the world was the missing bride? Back in the sanctuary of the Vanderbilt mansion, a maid tasked with restoring order to the chaos made a startling discovery. While clearing the dressing table in Consuelo's room, she noticed a small, charred corner of paper tucked deep inside the fireplace grate, nearly consumed by the previous night's fire. It was the only piece that had escaped the flames. Carefully, she retrieved it, the fragile paper crumbling at the edges. This was no ordinary note. The fragment, torn and smudged with soot, contained just a few lines of Consuelo's elegant, looping script, but its message was explosive. The words were a desperate, private confession, completely at odds with the serene bride the world thought it knew. One phrase stood out with heartbreaking clarity. "I cannot go through with this transaction of the heart." The word transaction was underlined so forcefully the pen had nearly torn through the paper. Another line, partially burned away, seemed to read, "My soul feels." It is a prison of. The rest was ash. The handwriting itself told a story of intense inner turmoil. The normally graceful letters were jagged and uneven, slanting wildly across the page, a physical manifestation of the panic that had gripped her. There were splotches on the paper, perhaps from tears, that had caused the ink to blur in several spots. This was not the note of a woman suffering from a sudden, fainting illness, as the official statement claimed. This was the raw, unfiltered testament of someone pushed to the absolute brink. The torn note revealed a profound and painful self-awareness. She saw her marriage for exactly what it was, a cold business deal dressed in the finery of tradition. The gilded cage was not just a metaphor, it was her lived reality, and she knew it. This single piece of evidence transformed the entire narrative. Her disappearance was not a spontaneous act of panic, but the final, deliberate act of a woman who had reached her breaking point. The question was no longer simply where she had gone, but what she had known, and for how long she had been planning her escape from a future she saw as a life sentence. While the family crafted a public story of illness, the household staff knew a very different truth. Servants move through grand homes like ghosts, their presence often ignored, yet they see and hear everything. In the hushed days following the disappearance, it was the testimonies of these maids and footmen that began to paint a far more troubling picture, of the bride's final hours. One lady's maid, sworn to secrecy but later compelled to speak, recalled a chilling detail from the night before the wedding. She had entered Consulo's room to turn down the bed and found the future Duchess not weeping, but standing perfectly still at her window, staring out into the dark with an expression of such hollow resignation it sent a shiver down the maid's spine. She described it not as sadness, but as a profound and unsettling calm, the quiet of someone who has already left. Another footman, tasked with managing the constant flow of wedding gifts, reported a strange incident 2 days prior. A small, unmarked package had been delivered not through the main entrance, but to a side door used by tradesmen. It was addressed to Miss Consulo in a simple, unadorned hand. He thought little of it at the time, merely adding it to the mountain of presents, but in hindsight, he wondered. What was in that plain wrapper? Was it a final message of support, or perhaps something more practical, something that aided her flight? The most telling account came from a young housemaid who, while dusting a hallway, overheard a heated, whispered conversation between Consulo and her mother. Alva's voice was a low, sharp hiss. She was not offering comfort, but issuing a command. The maid caught only a few fractured phrases, but they were damning. "You will do your duty. Think of the family name. There is no other path." Consulo's reply was a soft, broken whisper, a single, clear sentence the maid never forgot. She said, "I feel as though I am walking to my own execution." These fragments from the servants reveal a household simmering with silent despair. They witnessed the secret struggles, the hushed arguments, and the eerie stillness of a young woman preparing for a life she saw as a death sentence. Their collective testimony dismantles the fiction of a sudden fainting spell, revealing instead a deep and gathering storm. If the staff, the invisible witnesses, saw these signs so clearly, how could the family have missed them? Or did they simply choose to look away? Amid the whispers of kidnapping and cold feet, a third, more romantic theory began to capture the public imagination. Perhaps the bride was not a victim of a crime or a sudden panic, but the heroine of her own love story. The idea was irresistible, a beautiful rebellion against a cold-hearted transaction. Could Consulo Vanderbilt have been secretly in love with another man, someone her family would never approve of? And had she chosen this moment of maximum spectacle to escape to his waiting arms? The very notion transformed her from a pitiable figure into a potential icon of romantic defiance. Who could this mysterious suitor have been? The most persistent rumors pointed to a young man from her own social circle, Winthrop Rutherford. He was handsome, from a good family, but he possessed no title, no dukedom. He was simply a man she might have loved for himself, not for his lineage. Their paths had certainly crossed in the ballrooms of Newport and New York. They moved in the same glittering orbit, and it was easy for hopeful observers to imagine a secret understanding blossoming between them, a quiet romance conducted away from the watchful eyes of her domineering mother. Was it possible that a simple, heartfelt love for a man like Rutherford gave her the courage to do the unthinkable? The logistics of such an escape, however, were daunting. How does a woman in a heavy wedding dress, surrounded by attendants and thousands of onlookers, simply slip away to rendezvous with a lover? It would have required meticulous planning, an accomplice within the household, and a pre-arranged carriage waiting at a precise, discreet location. The abandoned bouquet could have been a signal, a prearranged sign that the plan was in motion. This theory paints Consuelo not as a frightened girl, but as a master strategist, using the chaos and visibility of her own wedding as the perfect cover for a disappearing act. Yet, for all its romantic appeal, there was a haunting question at its core. If this was a love story, why did no proud suitor ever step forward to claim it? If a man had helped her escape a miserable fate to be with him, why would he remain silent while her name was dragged through the mud and her family searched in frantic, desperate circles? His silence speaks volumes, suggesting either that he never existed or that their story was far more complicated and tragic than a simple fairy tale elopement. But beneath the romantic whispers and theories of panic, a much colder and more calculating possibility began to take root. What if the bride's fortune was the true target all along, and her disappearance was not an escape, but the result of a deliberate plot? This theory suggests that Consuelo Vanderbilt was not a runaway, but a pawn removed from the board by rivals who saw her immense wealth as a prize to be seized. In the cutthroat world of Gilded Age finance, a multi-million-dollar inheritance was a motive that could drive men to unthinkable acts. Who would have the audacity, and what would they stand to gain? The list of potential conspirators was as long as the Vanderbilt ledger. Business rivals of her father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, held grudges forged in the brutal wars of the railroad industry. These were men accustomed to destroying competitors, men for whom a strategic kidnapping or even a more permanent removal could be seen as just another business tactic. A vanished heiress could throw the Vanderbilt empire into chaos, destabilizing their holdings and creating opportunities for a corporate takeover of a different, darker kind. Then there were the greedy relatives, distant cousins or envious siblings who might have seen themselves written out of the will, or who believed the family fortune was not being distributed fairly. Eliminating the primary heiress could, in the twisted logic of inheritance law, redirect that river of gold into their own waiting hands. But the most chilling suspects, according to this dark narrative, were the very people she was meant to join. The Marlborough family was publicly humiliated, but were they also financially desperate enough to orchestrate a crime? If Consuelo vanished before the wedding, the marriage settlement would be void. But what if she disappeared after? As the Duchess of Marlborough, her fortune would have been under the Duke's control. Her sudden, mysterious death after the ceremony would have left her wealth in the hands of her grieving husband. It was a macabre but legally sound path to salvation for a bankrupt dynasty. This theory transforms the story from a personal tragedy into a premeditated financial assassination. The abandoned bouquet was not a signal to a lover, but a piece of staged evidence to support a narrative of a nervous bride who simply fled. The frantic public search by the Vanderbilts was then not just a mission to find a daughter, but a race against a hidden enemy who had already won. It asks a deeply unsettling question. In a world where everything has a price, was a young woman's life the final, unacceptable cost of doing business? The trail, cold and silent for weeks, suddenly blazed to life in the most unexpected of places. A telegram arrived at the Vanderbilt mansion from Paris. A frantic message from an American art dealer who swore he had seen Consuelo. He was a reputable man, not given to flights of fancy, and his account was chillingly specific. He claimed to have spotted her not in the gilded halls of the Ritz, but in a small, quiet bookstore along the left bank, a place frequented by students and artists, not duchesses. She was dressed not in satin, but in a simple, dark traveling suit, her famous features partially obscured by the brim of a hat. He said she was not browsing idly, but seemed to be in a focused, almost hurried conversation with the shopkeeper, exchanging a book for a small, sealed envelope before slipping out a back entrance and disappearing into the maze of Parisian alleyways. The witness was certain. It was her posture, he insisted, that unmistakable, regal bearing that no amount of plain clothing could truly hide. This single sighting electrified the search. Alva Vanderbilt immediately dispatched her most trusted agents across the Atlantic, a team of detectives who descended upon Paris with the full force of the family fortune behind them. They flooded the city with grainy photographs, offering substantial rewards to cab drivers, hotel clerks, and railway porters. They staked out the little bookstore for days, questioning the elderly proprietor relentlessly. The old man, however, was a vault. He admitted to nothing, claiming a faulty memory and a busy shop. He expressed no recognition of the photograph, his eyes veiled and unreadable. The detectives, skilled in intimidation and persuasion, could not crack his calm demeanor. They combed through passenger manifests of every steamship that had left New York in the days surrounding the wedding, looking for a Miss Smith or a Mrs. Jones who might have been traveling alone. They found a handful of possibilities, young women of the right age and description, but each lead dissolved into a dead end, a case of mistaken identity or a traveler with a verifiable past. The Paris sighting, so full of promise, began to feel like a mirage. Had the art dealer truly seen Consuelo Vanderbilt, or had he merely seen a ghost, a desperate projection of a city caught up in the global mystery? The investigation stretched on for weeks, consuming resources and hope. But ultimately, the trail in Paris ended at the bookstore's back door, a silent, brick-walled conclusion that offered no answers, only a deeper, more frustrating layer of international intrigue. Was this a carefully planned waypoint in a grand escape, or merely a case of a lonely man seeing the face he most wanted to see in a crowded foreign city? His name was Silas Croft, a man whose discretion was as legendary as his success. For 3 weeks, he moved through the underbelly of New York and the glittering salons of Newport. His final report, a confidential document, meant only for the eyes of William Vanderbilt. It began not with a theory, but with a single, overlooked fact. On the morning of the wedding, a private hansom cab, unaffiliated with the family's fleet, had been hired for a single, one-way trip. The driver, a man named O'Malley, was located through a network of informants who knew to keep quiet. He was reluctant, but a substantial payment loosened his tongue. His fare had been a young woman, he said, dressed not in white, but in a severe, dark gray traveling dress and a veiled hat. She had been waiting alone on a side street 2 blocks from the church, precisely at the moment the wedding march would have begun. She did not speak a word during the entire journey. Her instructions were for the West 30th Street ferry terminal, a chaotic and anonymous hub for the railway lines heading west. The driver remembered one thing clearly. As she stepped down from the cab, she paid him with a crisp, new banknote, and her hand did not shake. This was not the trembling hand of a frightened girl. It was the steady hand of someone executing a plan. Croft's investigation then turned to the destination. He spent days at the ferry terminal, showing a grainy photograph to ticket clerks and baggage handlers. Most shook their heads, the sheer volume of travelers making recollection impossible. But one elderly porter, who spent his days hauling trunks for first-class passengers, had a distinct memory. He recalled a woman of refined bearing, trying her best to look ordinary, who had purchased a ticket not for a grand trunk, but for a single, sturdy leather valise that was sent ahead to the baggage car. The ticket was for the Chicago Express, a train that connected to a web of lines stretching across the entire continent. This was the first solid evidence of a deliberate flight, not a panicked stumble. She had money, a destination, and the presence of mind to travel light. The trail, however, went cold in Chicago. The valise was never claimed from the station's baggage check. Croft concluded she had either abandoned it as a deliberate misdirection or had an accomplice retrieve it for her. It was a masterful stroke, ensuring that anyone following the most obvious lead would find themselves staring at an empty locker in a crowded station, with nowhere left to go. The detective's most chilling insight, however, came not from a clue, but from an absence. He looked deeply into the character of Winthrop Rutherford, the rumored secret love. Croft discovered that Rutherford had been in New York City on the day of the wedding, but he had been at his club, playing cards with a dozen witnesses until late in the afternoon. He had a verifiable public alibi. More tellingly, in the weeks that followed, Rutherford made no secret inquiries, showed no signs of distress or expectation. He simply went on with his life. Croft's report contained a single, devastating sentence on the matter. There is no evidence of a romantic entanglement, and every indication that Mr. Rutherford was as surprised by events as the rest of the city. This finding dismantled the world's favorite narrative. She had not run to a lover. She had run from a fate. Her escape was a solitary one, a profoundly lonely act of courage undertaken not for another person, but for the sovereignty of her own life. In his final assessment, Silas Croft dismissed the theories of kidnapping and foul play. The evidence of careful, self-directed preparation was too overwhelming. The cab, the ticket, the unclaimed bag, all pointed to a mind that was calm, clear, and ruthlessly determined. He believed Consuelo Vanderbilt had not merely fled her wedding. She had vanished her old identity entirely. His professional conclusion, written in stark, unadorned prose, was that she was alive, likely living under a new name in a Midwestern city, or perhaps even abroad, supported by funds she had quietly secured and hidden long before the ceremony. He ended his report with a personal reflection that went beyond the facts. He wrote that in all his years of hunting missing persons, he had never encountered a case where the subject had so completely and deliberately erased themselves. He was not chasing a victim. He was tracking a ghost of someone's own making. He closed his file with the sobering realization that the Vanderbilts, for all their power, were not looking for a daughter. They were looking for an asset that had independently decided to write itself off the ledger. The mystery was no longer about where she had gone, but about who she had finally chosen to become. The Vanderbilt Marlborough scandal sent a seismic shock through the transatlantic marriage market. For years, this exchange of American dollars for European titles had operated like a well-oiled machine, a silent agreement between new money and old blood. But Consulo's very public vanishing act ripped away the polite facade, exposing the raw human cost of these transactions. Suddenly, the entire enterprise seemed fraught with peril. European aristocrats, who had once viewed American heiresses as docile and infinitely wealthy, were forced to reconsider. A missing bride was more than an embarrassment. It was a massive financial and reputational risk. If a Vanderbilt girl could so spectacularly reject a dukedom, what did that say about the stability of the entire arrangement? It introduced a terrifying variable into their calculations: the possibility that the seemingly compliant American girl might have a will of her own. The fear was no longer just that an heiress might be gauche or unrefined, but that she might be unpredictable, that she could, at the final, most public moment, simply walk away and leave a noble suitor standing alone and bankrupt at the altar. The groom's market, once so confident, now had to grapple with a new kind of cold feat, one that could vaporize a fortune in an instant. For the American families, the scandal was a sobering lesson. They saw how quickly their daughter could become a global headline for all the wrong reasons. The pressure to secure a title was immense, but the Vanderbilt disaster highlighted a terrifying downside. What if their own daughter, pushed too far, broke under the strain? The careful grooming and immense financial settlements were no longer a guarantee of a smooth transition into the aristocracy. It made parents more cautious, more discerning. They began to look more critically at the titled suitors, not just at their lineage, but at their characters and their financial desperation. Was this Duke a stable prospect, or was he so destitute that he would make their daughter miserable? The fairy tale had been exposed as a high-stakes business deal, and after the Vanderbilt collapse, everyone involved was reading the fine print a little more carefully. The river of dollar princesses flowing to Europe did not dry up, but it certainly became more hesitant. The conversations in Newport drawing rooms grew more guarded, the courtships more prolonged. The ghost of the missing bride had cast a long shadow, reminding everyone that behind the glittering titles and immense fortunes were real people, capable of making choices that could shatter the most carefully laid plans. The ghost of the wedding that never was haunted both families for generations. For the Vanderbilts, the immediate humiliation was a deep stain on their social ambitions, a very public failure in their quest for acceptance. Though their fortune remained colossal, the whispers never fully subsided in the ballrooms of New York. They had proven that money could buy a duke, but it could not guarantee his bride would show up. The carefully constructed image of the family as sophisticated patrons of the arts was forever shadowed by the memory of their daughter's very public rejection of their grandest plan. Alva Vanderbilt, in particular, found her formidable reputation permanently altered. She was no longer just a brilliant social strategist. She was the mother from whom a daughter had to escape. The scandal became a dark, unspoken lesson in their own family history, a warning about the limits of parental control, even when backed by unimaginable wealth. Across the Atlantic, the damage to the Marlborough name was even more profound. The Duke was not just jilted, he was rendered a figure of pity and ridicule. The title of Duchess of Marlborough, once one of the most coveted in England, was now associated with a spectacular public failure. Other American heiresses and their cautious fathers looked upon him with a new and wary eye. Was his situation so desperate? Was his character so lacking that a girl would prefer utter obscurity to a life by his side? His desperate need for capital became glaringly obvious, making him a less desirable, not more desirable, match. He eventually married again, another American heiress, but the shadow of Consulo's disappearance hung over the union, a constant, unflattering comparison. The story solidified into a permanent cautionary tale in the lore of high society. For decades afterward, when a pushy mother or an ambitious father pressed a young woman into an advantageous match, the name Consulo Vanderbilt would be invoked in hushed tones. It was the ultimate what if. What if she breaks? What if she runs? The transaction of titles for cash was exposed as a perilous gamble with a human soul as the stakes. The gilded cage, everyone now understood, had an unlocked door, and one brave woman had shown the world that it was possible to walk through it, no matter the cost. Her disappearance did not end the era of the dollar princess, but it forever stripped it of its romantic pretense, revealing the cold, hard bargain at its heart. A dusty leather trunk sat forgotten for nearly a century in a Parisian attic. It was discovered in the early 1990s by a renovator working in an old apartment building, a building that had once been a discreet boarding house for well-to-do travelers. Inside, beneath a stack of yellowed linens, was a plain, unmarked journal. Its pages, filled with a familiar, elegant script, contained a secret history. This was the personal diary of Consulo Vanderbilt, and it offered a voice to the woman the world had only ever seen as a silent, vanishing figure. The entries spanned the final, frantic year of her life as a Vanderbilt heiress, leading right up to the eve of her wedding. They were not the musings of a frivolous girl, but the profound and painful chronicle of a soul in torment. In one of the earliest entries, written after her first formal introduction to the Duke, she confessed a deep sense of foreboding. "He is a man of perfect manners and cold eyes," she wrote. "When he looks at me, I do not feel seen as a person. I feel appraised, like a thoroughbred horse or a promising parcel of land." The words were a stark revelation, confirming the most cynical interpretations of the courtship. She was not a willing participant in a fairy tale. She was a commodity fully aware of her own price tag. The diary meticulously documented the immense psychological pressure applied by her mother, Alva. An entry from 3 months before the wedding detailed a particularly harsh confrontation. "A mother told me today that my feelings are irrelevant, a luxury our family cannot afford. She said my only duty is to obey, that the happiness of an entire lineage depends on my compliance." I tried to explain the hollow ache inside me, but she called it selfishness. The handwriting on this page was shaky, the ink blotted, as if written through tears. These were not the vague anxieties of a nervous bride, but the specific, documented wounds of emotional coercion. The most explosive entries, however, were those written in the final week. They revealed a mind not on the verge of breaking, but one that had already made a momentous decision. 2 days before the ceremony, she wrote, "The dress arrived today. They laced me into the satin cage, and all I could think of was the weight of it, the sheer, smothering weight of the life it represents. I have made my choice." I will not be a duchess. I will be free, or I will be nothing at all. This was not a spontaneous idea born of wedding day panic. It was a premeditated resolution. The final entry, dated the night before her disappearance, was chilling in its clarity. It reads, "Tomorrow, when the music plays, I will not be walking down the aisle. I will be walking out of this life. God forgive me, and may someone someday understand." The discovery of this diary fundamentally rewrote the history of the scandal. It proved that her flight was an act of immense courage and desperate self-preservation, a carefully planned rebellion executed with stunning precision. The world had long wondered if she was a victim or a strategist. The diary's fragile pages provided the definitive answer. She was both. The diary's discovery answered the why, but the how of her flawless disappearance remains a tantalizing puzzle for modern investigators. Applying today's forensic tools to this century-old cold case opens up entirely new possibilities for tracing her path. The first and most crucial piece of evidence would be that single, abandoned leather valise from the Chicago train station. In the Gilded Age, it was an unclaimed dead end. Today, it would be a forensic treasure trove. The bag itself, with its leather handles and metal clasps, would be meticulously examined for latent fingerprints. Even after decades, advanced chemical and optical techniques could potentially lift prints that Silas Croft's team could never have seen, identifying not just Consuelo, but anyone who helped her handle the bag. Inside that valise, every item would tell a story. The clothing fibers could be analyzed to determine their origin, potentially tracing the cloth to a specific mill or retailer. Any residual soil or pollen grains trapped in the seams could be analyzed through forensic palynology, pinpointing the geographic region where the bag was packed with astonishing accuracy. Was the pollen from the manicured gardens of Newport or from the wildflowers of the American Midwest? This single analysis could confirm or shatter the theory that she fled west. Then there is the question of the diary itself. Modern ink analysis could date the entries with precision, verifying they were indeed written in the months leading up to the wedding and not fabricated later. The paper, the glue and the binding, even the microscopic microbes left by her fingertips on the pages, all could be subjected to a battery of tests that would build an irrefutable timeline of her thoughts and plans. The most profound answers, however, might lie in the evidence we can no longer touch. Imagine if the bouquet she left behind had been preserved. Today, a floral arrangement is not just a symbol. It is a complex biological record. The stems and leaves would retain traces of her DNA from the oils and skin cells transferred during that final, fateful grasp. Genetic analysis could confirm it was hers, but more importantly, it could also reveal the presence of another person's DNA, potentially identifying an accomplice who handled the bouquet before she entered the church. Similarly, the charred fragment of her desperate note could be digitally enhanced. Multi-spectral imaging could potentially recover words now invisible to the naked eye, burned away but still lingering as ghostly chemical impressions in the paper, completing the sentence that begins, "My soul feels even the broader investigation would be transformed by digital tools." The passenger manifests that Croft's men painstakingly reviewed by hand would now be part of a searchable database. Algorithms could cross-reference thousands of names, dates, and destinations in seconds, looking for patterns and aliases that a human eye would miss. They could analyze the handwriting on those ticket purchases, comparing it to Consulo's known script. Social network analysis would map her entire world, identifying every friend, servant, and acquaintance, and then tracking their movements and financial transactions in the weeks following her disappearance to see if anyone acted as a hidden financial conduit. One of the greatest mysteries, the source of her escape funds, could likely be solved by following a digital paper trail her father's accountants could never have conceived of. Ultimately, modern forensics would shift the entire investigation from a search for a person to a reconstruction of a mind. The physical evidence would build a profile not of a victim, but of a meticulous operative. The careful selection of a plain traveling dress, the pre-purchased train ticket, the unclaimed bag meant to misdirect, all point to a level of planning and emotional control that is stunning. Today's behavioral analysts would conclude that this was not a desperate flight, but a strategic extraction, a self-rescue mission executed with a coolness that defied her age and upbringing. While we can never bring this case to a modern lab, the exercise forces a haunting question. If she could vanish so completely with the limited tools of her time, what truths are we still missing, simply because we haven't yet invented the technology to see them? A story this explosive could never be confined to the history books. The mystery of the runaway bride quickly became fertile ground for novelists and screenwriters, each eager to put their own spin on the tale. In countless fictional retellings, the cold business transaction is often rewritten as a grand romance. The real Consulo, who escaped alone and by her own design, is frequently given a dashing suitor, a secret lover who swoops in to rescue her from the altar. These versions transform her calculated courage into a more palatable, conventional love story, because the truth that a woman would choose solitude over a gilded cage was perhaps too radical for many audiences to accept. The creative liberties don't stop there. Some films depict her mother, Alva, as a cartoonish villain, twirling a metaphorical mustache as she locks her daughter away. Others invent elaborate kidnapping plots involving foreign spies or rival industrialists, adding car chases and coded messages where none existed. These adaptations simplify the complex psychological pressures into clear-cut heroes and villains, making the narrative easier to digest, but losing the profound sadness at its core. Why does this particular story hold such enduring power? It taps into a universal fantasy, the desire to shed an unwanted identity and start completely anew. We watch these fictionalized accounts and we wonder, do we have that same strength? Could we walk away from everything expected of us? The mystery of her new life is a blank canvas onto which we can project our own dreams of rebellion and reinvention. A modern streaming series in development promises to delve deeper, focusing not just on the wedding day, but on the meticulous planning that made it possible. It asks the question the history books cannot answer. What were the small, daily acts of defiance that led to that final, brazen escape? By dramatizing the hidden notes, the secret savings, and the quiet alliances with sympathetic servants, these new interpretations bring us closer than ever to the woman behind the headline. They remind us that the most captivating stories are not about where she went, but about the immense cost of buying one's own freedom. More than a century later, the mystery of the royal bride endures, a puzzle with missing pieces we can never recover. We know she planned her escape with stunning precision, that she fled not to a lover, but from a fate she saw as a prison. Yet the final chapters of her life remain a carefully guarded secret. What name did she choose for herself in her new life? Where did she find the courage to build an existence from nothing? And did she ever look back on the world she left behind with regret or with relief? The most plausible theory, supported by the private detective's report, is that she successfully established a quiet, anonymous life in America, perhaps as a teacher or a companion, her true identity known to no one. Another possibility suggests she may have sought refuge in a European convent or artistic community, finding solace far from the society that sought to define her. Yet without a body, a grave, or a definitive death record, even these logical conclusions are shaded with doubt. The ultimate truth is that Consuelo Vanderbilt achieved the most complete form of freedom imaginable in her Gilded Age. She did not just leave a wedding. She erased herself from the narrative others had written for her, choosing obscurity over opulence and self-possession over a crown. Her story is a permanent question mark in the annals of history, a haunting reminder that some secrets are so deeply buried, they become a part of the silence itself. Behind the headlines of scandal and the ledgers of finance lay a profound and quiet human tragedy. This was not merely a story of a broken contract, but of shattered hearts and fractured lives. For Consuelo, the personal cost was a lifetime of conditioning for a single role, only to find the courage to reject it at the ultimate moment. Imagine the sheer isolation of that decision, the knowledge that walking away meant losing everyone and everything she had ever known. Her escape was an act of self-preservation, but it was also a severing, a lonely emancipation paid for with her entire past. The freedom she won was bittersweet, forever shadowed by the family and identity she was forced to leave behind. For her mother, Alva, the public disgrace was a deep and personal failure. Her entire life's project, the meticulous grooming of her daughter for a throne, had collapsed in the most spectacular way possible. The whispers that followed her for the rest of her days were not just about social ambition, but about a fundamental breach in the sacred bond between mother and child. She had prioritized dynasty over daughter, and in return, she lost both. The victory she so desperately sought turned to ashes, leaving her to grapple with a hollow triumph and the unanswerable question of whether the price was ever worth it. And what of the Duke, standing humiliated at the altar? Beyond the bruised ego and the financial panic, there was a more subtle injury. He, too, was a product of his station, raised to believe his title was the ultimate prize. To have it so publicly rejected by the one person who was supposed to validate his entire worldview must have been a uniquely devastating blow. He was not just a jilted groom. He was a man whose very raison d'etre had been declared worthless. This human drama reminds us that every historical scandal is built upon a foundation of individual pain. The real cost of the Gilded Cage was not measured in dollars, but in the silent tears, the broken trusts, and the lonely paths chosen in a desperate search for a life that felt like one's own. The story of the vanished bride remains one of history's most captivating puzzles, a perfect storm where immense wealth, desperate power, and profound human mystery collided. We are left with the ghost of a woman who rejected a gilded destiny, a fortune large enough to rescue a dynasty, and a mystery so complete it has defied solution for over a century. This tale endures not because we have the answers, but because the questions it raises are timeless. How much of our own lives are truly our own to command? What would we sacrifice for the freedom to choose our own path? The line between truth and legend has blurred, with each generation adding its own layer of interpretation, turning Consuelo Vanderbilt into a symbol far greater than the person she ever was. She is both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder that the most compelling stories are often those where the final chapter is missing, leaving us to wonder, to debate, and to imagine what we would have done in her place. What do you believe happened after she stepped out of that church and into the unknown? Share your own theories in the comments below. The greatest mysteries are those we continue to solve together.